Hey everybody, my name is Timpedia and welcome to my Dragon Age 2 review. We're here to find out if it's BioWare's latest epic masterpiece or if it's the secret they want to bury away in their closet. Either way, let's find out. Lower the gates! However, before the review actually starts, let me give a quick background on where I'm coming from as a player. I played through all of Dragon Age Origins, along with all of the DLC that came with the game. I've also read both the books, though that really doesn't factor in at all here. For my playthrough of Dragon Age 2, I imported my character, which was a good female mage. Shut up, I did it for my girlfriend. With Alistair as King of Ferelden at the end of the Blight. So with my background out of the way, let's get on to the actual review, starting with what every BioWare game should excel in, the story. The story for Dragon Age 2 is both a great success in some ways and a dismal failure in others. Though this still elevates it above most other games I've played recently, it's still what I would consider to be the weakest story of a BioWare game I've played, and I've played them all since Knights of the Old Republic. One of the biggest problems with this story is that it takes a very, very long time to get going. At the start of the game, you escape Lothering as it's destroyed by the Darkspawn during the Blight, and you go to your mother's home city of Kirkwall. You get into the city by either joining a mercenary gang or a group of smugglers, and a year passes, so the Blight is over. The game has a total of 3 of these giant jumps forward in time. All they really serve for is to have one big event happen. Although the only problem is, everything else stays the same, except for a few minor detail changes. Hawke doesn't evolve at all over this time. After the year passes, we encounter the biggest problem of the story, the first act. Your overall goal at this time is to get both 50 sovereigns and a map of the deep roads so you can become a partner of an expedition that will supposedly make you incredibly wealthy due to the fact that everyone else is too much of a wuss to brave a few Darkspawn. As motivation goes, it's incredibly weak. For the whole course of the first act, I had no real motivation to do anything. I didn't care about the expedition, and there was no driving reason to join it, other than the fact that you had to keep the plot going. However, if you can force your way through the first act of the game, the second act actually has a pretty decent story, and the third act is by far the best, with a very driving story that really keeps you interested in wanting to finish the game. But I'm not going to spoil these at all for you. You guys are going to have to find these stories out on your own. However, this does bring up another interesting point about the story. With the 3-year gaps between the 3 main acts of the game, the 1-year gap was only between the prologue act and the first act. The other ones are all 3 years. BioWare seems to be hiding something. The 3 acts actually build off each other very little, at least directly. Some small side quests might come up, and some small bits do call back to earlier acts, but overall the 3 acts have very disconnected stories. It almost seems as if BioWare took 3 stories they wanted to have in the second game, and split them up into 3 parts of one final game, since none of them, especially the first act, could have stood up on their own. However, that's enough about the overall story of the game. Now it's on to the best part of the story, the companion characters. BioWare always does a great job fleshing out the backstories and characteristics of your companions, and this game is no exception. Your group of companions, while feeling slightly smaller than other BioWare games, are still very well developed. All of them, including the DLC character Sebastian, have very full backstories and are all very well developed. Probably my 2 favorites were Varric, the hilarious storytelling dwarf who is actually telling the story of the game to a Chantry Seeker. This whole game is actually told as a flashback from Varric's point of view, for those of you who didn't play the demo or haven't watched my Let's Play. Oh joy. And Merrill, a Dalish elf who became a blood mage to try to restore an artifact she hoped would help her people. But even though I'm only mentioning these 2, trust me when I say that all the companions are well developed. Except maybe Isabella, though she's really just a selfish airhead anyway, so who cares. More than likely, the only thing that will carry you through Act 1 is meeting and talking to your companions. However, what would the main plot be worth if you didn't have side quests to enjoy in the meantime? Luckily, not many of these quests are fetch quests. And a lot of them actually do have a number of steps to them to complete them, and do give you a good representation of what life in Kirkwall is like for those who live there. Before I leave the topic of story, there is one big problem I would like to address: plot holes. For this game in Mass Effect 2, BioWare's made it possible to import the first game's character to make the second game more personalized. Fine, great idea. However, the problem is that in this game, BioWare completely ignored some of the first game, namely the very important expansion and DLC. Now, I know DLC isn't supposed to be an actual part of the game, per se, but when the second game directly builds off DLC from the first, you should allow players to import that data too. The biggest error here is Anders. Anders shows up in Act 1, which takes place right after the first game ends and the Blight has just been defeated. However, in the expansion of the first game, Awakening, which takes place 6 months after the first game, Anders is a Grey Warden in Amaranthine. Plus, he talks about his time as a Grey Warden, and he's the only one with the deep road maps you need for the expedition. What the hell, BioWare? Why establish Awakening's timeline and then completely ruin it with this game? Actually, it physically couldn't have taken place yet, since the hero of Ferelden shouldn't have even left for Amaranthine from Denerim yet. This certainly isn't the only reference to Awakening, however. Nathaniel Howe, a Grey Warden character companion from Awakening, actually shows up during Act 2 and tells you that the Orden sided with the Architect. What? I killed the damn Architect! I can understand if they wanted to make this canon, but then why make it an option in Awakening to kill him? And why limit the importing of characters to Dragon Age 1 only? Why leave out Awakening in the DLC? Awakening factors into this game way too much for them to have overlooked importing it. I can understand they didn't want too many variables from that game, but that would have been the best part. You would have been completely building a game based on everything the first had to offer, and crafting the characters based on those you used for Awakening and Origins, unless you just imported your Dragon Age Origins character into Awakening like I did. Unfortunately, BioWare took the lazy way out, making Awakening set in stone, and then still ruined the timeline of the games. Before the Awakening plot holes make me lose my mind, let's go on to the last bit of story I want to talk about, which, lucky for us, is good, and that's the main character, Hawke. Giving Hawke a voice was definitely a great choice, especially since his dialogue is very well written. Plus, the conversation wheel from Mass Effect has been brought into this game and improved to show a little symbol for each choice you're making so you can see what kind of option it is, whether it's argumentative, peaceful, funny, etc. This is a big improvement over Mass Effect, since in that game you only had red or blue dialogue options if they were Renegade or Paragon, and everything else was just white. Another great thing is that Hawke actually talks on his own in a realistic fashion. Conversations can go on with him without you picking every exact piece of dialogue, which makes sense since you usually wouldn't threaten someone during a conversation for no reason whatsoever. Also, Hawke interacts with his party members similar to how they have conversations with you around, which makes him seem like much more part of a team than a completely separate hero. However, as a tip about playing the game, being a mage gets you much more involved in the story. Though I only got one playthrough as a mage, I've heard from a number of other people that not being a mage makes the story a lot less personal and less interesting, which I can totally understand, since being a mage is key to a number of main decisions you make, especially in the third act. You can certainly enjoy the game as a non-mage, but understand the story won't have nearly as much impact for you if you don't. And with that, we have finally covered all of the main story aspects of Dragon Age 2. Now it's time to move on to the second most important pillar of the game, gameplay. Like the story, the gameplay in Dragon Age 2 is both good and bad. The combat, for instance, has had a much needed animation improvement, which makes the combat seem much more realistic and fluid. Archers will take out their knives during close combat, and mages will swing their staves around when doing basic attacks. Also, all of the special moves have their own animation that are closely linked to the action. Fireball has the mage whipping his arm forward. Hail of Arrows has the archer point into the sky, even if the actual ability makes no sense. And Bellow has the warriors spread their arms and roar a great battle cry. However, remember that I did say that there were negatives to this aspect as well.
Most of these are focused on the menus and equipment.
Unlike in Dragon Age Origins, the menus here don't try to immerse you by having it in a book. It's just a totally separate menu, where they decided to give you smaller pictures and text than in the last game.
Seriously, the text and everything, it's almost microscopically small. This may be because I was playing it on 1920 by 1080, but I guess BioWare just doesn't care about the higher resolutions at all. Clearly they needed all this giantly impressive red space on the menu that you use for nothing.
Also, a big gripe I have here is the names. Most of the equipment has totally generic names. In Origins, every single piece of gear had a different name, but here, half of them have names like belt, amulet, or ring. And they do different things. They all have different abilities, but the same damn name.
Why, BioWare, why have you become so lazy in your old age?
One final gripe I have about the equipment is the armor. You are the only one who can wear actual armor. Seriously, all that DLC armor and all of the in-game armor can only be worn by you. I was stunned when I found this out. I gave my party members tons of the DLC armors I got in the first game. Now all you can do is buy upgrades that make their armor better. I can understand they wanted it to be constant for each character, but it makes the DLC armor like Blood Dragon, Sir Isaac, and all the rest pointless unless you want to switch every 5 minutes. Again, this is a very disappointing change from the first game.
Now, I could keep going on about minor gameplay gripes, like corners having invisible walls that are bigger than the actual corner, activating combat animations when I just try to move with the mouse instead of the keyboard. But I'm going to move on to another important pillar of the game. The graphics. Now, before anyone cries out, Tim, you've talked before about how graphics aren't important, so why are you saying they are now? They did not factor into my rating for the game much at all, maybe a little bit, that's it. They really are not an important thing, but I do feel that I should mention them. So now, let's actually just talk about the graphics briefly and then finish this review off.
This game continues BioWare's great tradition of looking great at a distance, but having ugly, bare-bones textures up close. On my decently high-end computer, I was able to play with DirectX 11 running, with all the graphics on high. While it did look better, they still didn't look great, especially when I tried it out on DirectX 9. The facial animations are pretty solid, not perfect, but you can tell what's going on. There is at least more variation between species. Dwarves always look different, but in the first game, humans and elves look pretty similar. Not so now. With the change in art style, the elves look much more angular and have much larger ears, so they are very easily distinguishable from their human counterparts.
The art style is probably the biggest graphical thing to get over from the first game. The biggest group that was affected by this art design was the Darkspawn, which for some reason included the removal of the Genlocks and Shrikes from the general population of the Darkspawn. For some reason?
The only remaining Darkspawn species you get to see in-game, the Hurlocks and the Ogres, both have had overhauls to their appearance. Ogres look smaller and less threatening, while Hurlocks also manage to look smaller and less fierce. The Qunari, however, make up for this by looking a lot more threatening with their giant horns and their size increased. Humans look the same overall, possibly a bit softer if anything. Equipment looks much smaller, which is good since BioWare still doesn't care about things clipping together, which was a huge problem with the giant armor sets in the first game. Overall, the art style is more organic, but either way is a shift you have to get used to from playing the first game.
And so concludes my Dragon Age 2 review. I would tentatively recommend this game. If you can dig through the BioWare hazardous waste pile, you'll find a pretty good game buried under here. However, you would be perfectly within your rights to start playing and then just stop due to the incredible slowness of Act 1. If you had to choose between this game and the first game, I would definitely recommend the first. Also because the first one is cheap enough by now that you can get all the DLC in a package with it, which makes it an even better game. But anyway guys, that's enough about Dragon Age 2 for now. In the end, as I said, tentative recommendation, play the first, but if you want to, nothing's stopping you from this. I would say play the demo first, but other than that guys, my name is Timpedia and I'll catch you next time.